The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine gardens of Windsor Castle, as Captain James Morrison adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day of royal duty. For 15 years he had served as one of Prince George's personal guards, watching the young royal grow from a curious toddler into a thoughtful 12-year-old boy who carried himself with quiet dignity beyond his years. James had seen many changes during his service. He remembered when Prince George was just learning to walk, stumbling through the palace corridors while his parents, Prince William and Catherine, watched with protective smiles. Now the boy moved with purpose and grace, though he still possessed that spark of curiosity that made him special among the royal children. On this particular Tuesday morning, James noticed something different in Prince George's demeanor as they prepared for the day's scheduled activities. The young prince stood by his bedroom window, gazing out at the grounds where several groundskeepers were tending to the elaborate flower beds. His expression was more serious than usual, and James could sense that something was weighing on the boy's mind. "Your Royal Highness, we should prepare for your morning lessons," James said gently, using the formal address that protocol required, even though he had grown genuinely fond of the young prince over the years. Prince George turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a maturity that sometimes surprised even those closest to him. "James, may I ask you something before we go?" "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to choose your own path in life? To wake up and decide what you want to do that day without anyone telling you?" The question caught James off guard. In all his years of service, he had rarely heard such philosophical musings from the young prince. It was the kind of question that revealed the deep thinking that went on behind those thoughtful eyes. "I suppose most people do wonder about that from time to time," James replied carefully. "Even those of us who have chosen our path sometimes think about the roads not taken." Prince George nodded slowly, as if James's answer confirmed something he had been thinking about.
"I've been watching the gardeners this morning."
"They seem so peaceful, so content with their work. They're creating something beautiful, and they can see the results of their efforts every day." James followed the prince's gaze to the window, where indeed the groundskeepers were working with obvious care and pride, trimming hedges and planting new flowers in preparation for an upcoming garden party. There was something peaceful about their methodical work, something that spoke to a simpler way of life. "Your Royal Highness, your role in life allows you to create beauty too, just in different ways," James offered. "The work you'll do as a member of the royal family will touch many lives. But will it be my choice?" Prince George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or will it always be what's expected of me?" The question hung in the air between them, and James felt the weight of it. He had sworn an oath to protect this boy, but he was beginning to realize that protection might mean more than just physical safety. It might mean protecting his right to think freely, to question, to wonder about his place in the world. As they made their way through the castle corridors toward the library where Prince George's tutor was waiting, James couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation was the beginning of something significant. The young prince walked beside him with his usual poise, acknowledging the staff they passed with polite nods and genuine smiles. But James could see that his mind was elsewhere. The morning lessons proceeded as usual. Prince George studied history, mathematics, and literature with the focused attention that had always impressed his tutors. But James, standing quietly in the corner of the room as was his custom, noticed the way the prince's eyes would drift to the window whenever they discussed historical figures who had shaped their own destinies. During a break between lessons, Prince George approached James again. "You chose to become a guard, didn't you? You could have done anything else." "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I chose this path because I wanted to serve, to protect, to be part of something meaningful. And you're happy with your choice?" James considered the question seriously. "Most days, yes. There have been challenges, times when I've questioned whether I made the right decision. But overall, I feel that my life has purpose." Prince George absorbed this information with the intensity he brought to all his studies. "I want to feel that way too. I want to know that what I do matters because I chose it, not just because I was born to it." The weight of the young prince's words settled over James like a heavy cloak. He was beginning to understand that Prince George was grappling with questions that went to the very heart of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. These weren't the idle thoughts of a bored child. They were the serious contemplations of a young person trying to understand his place in the world. As the day progressed, James found himself paying closer attention to Prince George's interactions with everyone around him. He watched as the prince thanked the kitchen staff for his lunch with genuine warmth, as he listened intently to his riding instructor's advice about caring for his horse, and as he spent extra time helping a younger page who was struggling with his duties. In each interaction, James saw evidence of the kind of person Prince George was becoming: thoughtful, kind, and deeply aware of the people around him. But he also saw the careful control the prince exercised over himself, the way he always remembered his position and responsibilities, even in casual moments. That evening, as James escorted Prince George back to his chambers after dinner with his family, the prince paused in the corridor where portraits of his ancestors lined the walls. He studied the painted faces of kings and queens, princes and princesses who had lived and died in service to the crown. "They all look so serious," Prince George observed. "Do you think they were happy?" James looked at the portraits with new eyes, seeing them not as symbols of royal duty but as individuals who had once faced their own questions about purpose and choice. "I think happiness means different things to different people, Your Royal Highness. Perhaps some of them found happiness in duty, others in the knowledge that they made a difference in the world." Prince George nodded thoughtfully, and James could see that the boy was filing away this conversation, along with all the others they had shared that day. Something was building in the young prince's mind, some decision or realization that would soon change everything. The next morning brought an unexpected change to the usual routine. Prince George appeared in the breakfast room earlier than normal, already dressed and ready for the day. James noticed immediately that the young prince seemed different. There was a sense of determination about him that hadn't been there before, as if he had spent the night reaching some important decision. "Good morning, James," Prince George said, his voice carrying a new note of confidence. "I was hoping we could take a different route through the gardens today before my lessons begin." "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Any particular reason?" "I'd like to speak with some of the groundskeepers, if that would be appropriate. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize I don't know very much about the people who work here every day." James felt a flutter of both pride and concern. Pride because the prince's interest in the staff showed his growing maturity and empathy, but concern because any deviation from protocol required careful consideration. However, he also recognized that part of his duty was to help Prince George learn about all aspects of life, including the experiences of those who serve the royal family. "I think that could be arranged, Your Royal Highness. Perhaps we could speak with Mr. Henderson, the head groundskeeper. He's been working here for over 20 years. Prince George's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That would be perfect. I'd like to understand what drew him to this work, whether he finds it fulfilling." As they walked through the meticulously maintained gardens, James watched Prince George with growing admiration. The boy moved with his usual royal composure, but there was something more authentic about his bearing now, as if he were allowing more of his true personality to show through the formal exterior that had been carefully cultivated since childhood. They found Mr. Henderson near the rose garden, carefully pruning the bushes in preparation for the spring blooming season. He was a weathered man in his 60s with hands that spoke of decades of honest work and eyes that held the kind of peaceful contentment that came from a life well lived. "Mr. Henderson," Prince George said, approaching with respect rather than the formal distance that protocol might have suggested. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." The groundskeeper looked up in surprise, quickly removing his hat. "Not at all, Your Royal Highness. It's an honor to speak with you. Actually, I was hoping you might tell me about your work. I've been watching from my window and you always seem so content, so at peace with what you're doing." Mr. Henderson's weathered face broke into a smile. "Well, Your Royal Highness, I suppose I am. There's something special about working with growing things, about being part of creating beauty that brings joy to others." "How did you come to this work? Did you always know this was what you wanted to do?" The question clearly touched something deep in the older man. "I grew up on a small farm, Your Royal Highness. My father was a farmer and his father before him. I learned early that there's dignity in working with your hands, in nurturing life from the soil. When I came to work here, I found that same satisfaction, but with the added pleasure of knowing that my work contributes to something larger than myself." Prince George listened with an intensity that James had rarely seen outside the boy's academic studies. Do you ever regret your choice? Wonder what might have been if you had chosen a different path? Mr. Henderson paused in his pruning, considering the question with the same seriousness with which it had been asked. I think everyone wonders about the roads not taken, Your Royal Highness. But I've learned that contentment comes not from having unlimited choices, but from finding meaning and purpose in the choice you make. I wake up every morning knowing that my work matters, that I'm contributing to something beautiful and lasting. And that's enough for you? That sense of purpose? More than enough, Your Royal Highness. You see, I've come to understand that true happiness doesn't come from doing whatever you want whenever you want. It comes from knowing that your life has meaning, that you're making a difference, even if it's in ways that might seem small to others. James watched as Prince George absorbed these words, and he could almost see the young prince's mind working, processing this perspective against his own situation and the questions that had been troubling him. Mr. Henderson, may I ask you something else? Do you think it's possible to find that same sense of purpose even when your role in life is predetermined? The groundskeeper set down his pruning shears and looked directly at Prince George with kind but serious eyes. Your Royal Highness, I believe that purpose isn't found in what you do, but in how you choose to do it. I've known people in every walk of life, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, even members of the royal family, who have found deep satisfaction in their roles because they chose to approach them with dedication, compassion, and a desire to serve others. But what if you're not sure that the predetermined path is right for you? What if you feel called to something different? James felt his breath catch. This conversation was moving into territory that touched on fundamental questions about Prince George's future, about the very nature of royal duty and personal choice. Mr. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and James could see that he understood the weight of the question being asked. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Your Royal Highness, I think the most important thing is to be true to yourself, while also considering the impact of your choices on others. Sometimes the greatest act of service is to embrace the role you've been given and find ways to make it meaningful. Other times, the greatest service might require stepping away from expectations to follow a different calling. How do you know which is which? I think you know in your heart, Your Royal Highness. But it requires honest reflection about what truly matters to you, what kind of difference you want to make in the world, and whether you can achieve that within your given role or need to seek it elsewhere. Prince George nodded slowly, and James could see that the boy was filing away every word of this conversation. They talked for a few more minutes about gardening techniques and the changing seasons, but James sensed that the most important part of the exchange had already taken place. As they walked back toward the castle, Prince George was unusually quiet. James respected his silence, understanding that the young prince needed time to process what he had heard. But as they reached the entrance to the main building, Prince George stopped and turned to his guard. James, do you think it's possible to serve others and follow your own heart at the same time? I think the best service often comes from those who have found a way to align their hearts with their duties. Your Royal Highness, Prince George smiled, the first completely unguarded smile James had seen from him in days. Thank you for arranging that conversation. I think I'm beginning to understand something important. As they entered the castle and prepared for the day's formal schedule, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a turning point. Prince George's questions were becoming more focused, more purposeful, and James sensed that the young prince was moving toward a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. 3 weeks had passed since Prince George's conversation with Mr. Henderson, and James had watched with growing fascination as the young prince seemed to undergo a quiet transformation. The questions hadn't stopped, but they had become more focused, more deliberate. Prince George had begun seeking out conversations with people throughout the castle staff, from the kitchen workers to the stable hands, always with the same underlying curiosity about purpose, choice, and contentment. On this particular morning, James arrived at Prince George's chambers to find the young prince sitting at his desk, writing intently in a leather-bound journal that James had never seen before. The prince looked up as James entered, and there was something different in his expression, a sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. Good morning. James, I've been doing some writing, some thinking about everything we've discussed and all the conversations I've had with the staff. And what conclusions have you reached, Your Royal Highness? Prince George set down his pen and turned to face James fully. I've realized that I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been thinking about choice as if it were a simple matter of doing what I want versus doing what's expected of me. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it? James nodded, impressed by the depth of the prince's reflection. How so? Every person I've spoken with has taught me something different about finding purpose and meaning. Mr. Henderson showed me that contentment comes from knowing your work matters. Mrs. Collins in the kitchen told me that she finds joy in nourishing others, even when the work is demanding. Thomas in the stables explained that caring for the horses gives him a sense of connection to something larger than himself. Prince George paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. They've all found ways to make their work meaningful, regardless of whether they originally chose it or whether it was the path they expected to take. And I think I've been missing something important about my own situation. What's that, Your Royal Highness? I've been so focused on whether I chose this role that I haven't been thinking about how I can choose to approach it. Every person I've talked to has had challenges, moments of doubt, times when they questioned their path. But they found meaning by deciding how to do their work, not just by doing it. James felt a surge of pride in the young prince's growing wisdom. That's a very mature perspective, Your Royal Highness. But there's something else. James, something I need to share with you, and I hope you'll understand. The serious tone in Prince George's voice made James pay even closer attention. The prince stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where his journey of discovery had begun. I've been thinking about what kind of difference I want to make in the world, and I've realized that the traditional royal path isn't the only way to serve others. There are so many ways to contribute, to help people, to make the world better. James felt a flutter of concern. Your Royal Highness, your position gives you unique opportunities to serve others, to use your influence for good. You're absolutely right, and I don't dismiss that lightly. But I've also realized that I have a particular calling, something that speaks to my heart in a way that traditional royal duties don't. Prince George turned back to James, his young face serious but determined. I want to work with children who don't have the advantages I've had. I want to teach, to mentor, to help young people discover their own potential. I've been reading about organizations that work with disadvantaged youth, and I feel drawn to that work in a way I've never felt drawn to ceremonial functions or state dinners. James was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. He had sensed that Prince George was building towards some kind of decision, but he hadn't anticipated this particular direction. Your Royal Highness, that's a noble calling. Have you discussed this with your parents? Not yet, but I plan to. I know it will be difficult for them to understand, and I know there will be complications. But James, I've never felt more certain about anything in my life. Prince George pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, filled with what appeared to be research materials and handwritten notes. I've been learning about a program that trains teachers to work with at-risk youth. They focus on helping children who have faced trauma, poverty, or family difficulties. The work is challenging, but the impact is real and immediate. James looked through the materials, impressed by the thoroughness of Prince George's research. The young prince had clearly been thinking about this for weeks, considering not just his own desires but the practical aspects of such a significant change. I understand that stepping away from my royal duties would disappoint many people, Prince George continued. I understand that it might be seen as abandoning my responsibilities, but I've come to believe that the greatest service I can provide is to follow this calling, to use my abilities where they can make the most difference. And you believe that's in teaching rather than in royal service? I believe it's in working directly with young people who need guidance and support. Think about it, James. I've had every advantage in life, the best education, the most supportive family, every opportunity to develop my potential. Shouldn't I use that privilege to help children who haven't had those same opportunities? James was struck by the maturity and thoughtfulness of Prince George's reasoning. This wasn't a case of a young person rebelling against expectations or seeking an easier path. This was a carefully considered decision based on a genuine desire to serve others in a specific way. Your Royal Highness, have you considered that you might be able to pursue this interest while still maintaining your royal role? Perhaps through patronage of relevant organizations or by establishing your own charitable foundation? Prince George had clearly anticipated this question. I have considered that, and it's certainly one option. But I've realized that what I want isn't to support this work from a distance or to be a figurehead for others' efforts. I want to be in the classroom, working directly with the children, being present for their daily struggles and victories. He paused, looking directly at James with an intensity that was both mature and vulnerable. I want to know that when a child makes progress, when they overcome a challenge or discover something they're good at, that I played a direct role in that success. I want to matter to them not because of my title, but because of what I can offer as a teacher and mentor. James felt his heart constrict with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the depth of Prince George's compassion and the clarity of his vision, but sorrow for the difficult road that lay ahead if the prince chose to pursue this path. Your Royal Highness, I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my respect and support. What you're describing is a beautiful vision of service. Prince George's face brightened with relief and gratitude. Thank you, James. That means more to me than you know. I was hoping you would understand because I have something important to ask of you. Anything, Your Royal Highness. When I make my decision known to my family and to the public, it's going to create a great deal of controversy and attention. I'm going to need people around me who understand my choice, who support my right to follow my calling even if it's unconventional. Prince George took a deep breath before continuing.
James, you've been more than a guard to me.
You've been a friend, a confidant, someone who has helped me think through the most important decision of my life. I would be honored if you would consider staying with me, not as a royal guard, but as someone who supports my new path. The request hung in the air between them, and James realized that Prince George was asking him to make his own choice about service, purpose, and meaning. The irony wasn't lost on him that the prince's decision to step away from traditional expectations was creating an opportunity for James to do the same. James spent the rest of that day in deep contemplation, walking the familiar corridors of Windsor Castle with new eyes. Prince George's request had opened a door he hadn't even realized existed, and now he found himself facing his own moment of choice about purpose and meaning. That evening, after his official duties were complete, James sat in his small apartment within the castle grounds, thinking about the 15 years he had dedicated to royal service. They had been good years, filled with purpose and pride. But Prince George's words had awakened something in him that he hadn't expected. A recognition that there were other ways to serve, other paths to meaning. He thought about his own background, the experiences that had led him to become a royal guard. He had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, the son of a police officer and a school teacher. His mother had always believed in the power of education to transform lives, and his father had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and service. When he joined the Royal Protection Unit, he felt he was honoring both of those influences. But now, listening to Prince George's passion for working with disadvantaged youth, James found himself remembering his mother's stories about the children she had taught, the ones who came from difficult circumstances, but who flourished when given the right support and encouragement. He remembered how her eyes would light up when she talked about a student who had overcome obstacles or discovered a hidden talent. The next morning, James arrived at Prince George's chambers to find the young prince preparing for what would clearly be a difficult conversation with his parents. Prince George was dressed more formally than usual, and there was a nervous energy about him that spoke to the magnitude of what he was about to do. "Are you ready for this, Your Royal Highness?" Prince George nodded, though James could see the mixture of determination and apprehension in his eyes. "I think I am. I've prepared what I want to say, and I've thought through their likely concerns and objections. But James, I wanted to speak with you first. Have you given any thought to what we discussed yesterday?" James had indeed given it thought, and he had reached a conclusion that surprised even him. "Your Royal Highness, I've been thinking about my own journey to this point, about what has given my life meaning and purpose. When I became a royal guard, I thought I was choosing the highest form of service available to me. And now I realize that service takes many forms, and that sometimes the most meaningful service happens not in palaces or state functions, but in classrooms and community centers, in the daily work of helping people build better lives." Prince George's face showed a flicker of hope. "Does that mean—" "It means that if you're serious about this path, if you truly believe this is your calling, then I would be honored to support you in whatever way I can. You're right that you'll need people around you who understand your choice. More than that, I think I'm ready to make my own choice about how I want to serve." The relief and gratitude in Prince George's expression was unmistakable. "James, you have no idea how much that means to me. I know this isn't going to be easy for any of us. The best choices rarely are, Your Royal Highness, but that doesn't make them wrong." They made their way through the castle toward the family's private dining room, where Prince George had arranged to speak with his parents during breakfast. James could feel the tension radiating from the young prince, but also his unwavering resolve. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of rebellion. This was a young man who had thought carefully about his life and his purpose, and who was prepared to accept the consequences of following his heart. As they approached the dining room, Prince George paused. "James, whatever happens in there, I want you to know that these past few weeks, having someone who truly listened to my questions and concerns, who helped me think through this decision, it's meant everything to me. It's been an honor, Your Royal Highness, and whatever path you choose, I believe you'll make a tremendous difference in the world." The conversation with Prince William and Catherine was everything James had expected it would be: difficult, emotional, and complex. From his position near the door, James could hear the surprise, concern, and eventual understanding in their voices as Prince George explained his decision with the same thoughtfulness and maturity he had shown in their private conversations. There were tears, there were arguments, there were long periods of silence as the family grappled with the implications of such an unprecedented choice. But throughout it all, James was struck by the love and respect that underscored even the most difficult moments of the discussion. Prince William's voice carried the weight of his own experience, with royal duty when he spoke about the importance of service to the crown and country. Catherine's responses reflected her understanding of the challenges facing young people today and her admiration for her son's compassionate heart, even as she worried about the practical and personal costs of his decision. But it was Prince George's voice that remained steady throughout, articulate and passionate as he explained his vision for how he could best serve others, how he could use his privileges and education to make a real difference in the lives of children who needed advocates and mentors. Hours passed before the family emerged from their private discussion. Prince George's eyes were red-rimmed but determined, and James could see that while the conversation had been painful, it had also been productive. The young prince had clearly made his case effectively, even if full acceptance would take time. "They want time to think about it," Prince George told James as they walked back toward his chambers. "They want to discuss it with other family members, with advisors, with people who can help them understand the full implications." "That's understandable, Your Royal Highness. This is unprecedented territory for everyone involved. But James, they also heard me. Really heard me. My mother said something that I'll never forget. She said that she would rather have a son who followed his heart in service to others than one who fulfilled his royal duties without passion or purpose." James felt his own eyes well up with emotion. "That's a remarkable thing for a parent to say. My father is struggling more with it, which I understand. The weight of tradition, of duty, of what people will expect, it's enormous. But he also said that he's proud of the thoughtfulness I've shown, that he can see this isn't a decision I've made lightly." They spent the rest of the day in relative quiet, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Prince George continued with his scheduled lessons and activities, but James could see that his mind was elsewhere, working through the next steps of a journey that would change everything. That evening, as James prepared to leave for the day, Prince George called him aside once more. "James, regardless of what my family ultimately decides, I want you to know that I'm going forward with this. I may have to wait until I'm older. I may have to find ways to compromise with family expectations, but I'm not giving up on this calling. I believe you, Your Royal Highness, and I want you to know that whatever challenges lie ahead, you won't face them alone." Prince George smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a smile of complete peace. "Thank you, James. Tomorrow is going to bring new challenges, new conversations, new decisions for both of us. But tonight I feel more certain about my path than I ever have before." As James left the castle that evening, he realized that he too felt more certain about his path than he had in years. Prince George's courage in choosing to follow his heart had inspired James to examine his own calling, and he was beginning to see possibilities he had never considered before. 2 months had passed since Prince George's conversation with his parents, and the atmosphere around the castle had shifted in subtle but significant ways. There had been numerous family meetings, consultations with advisors, and careful discussions about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. Throughout it all, Prince George had maintained his resolve while demonstrating remarkable patience and understanding for his family's concerns. James had watched this process unfold with growing admiration for the young prince's maturity. Rather than pressing for immediate acceptance or threatening to act without family support, Prince George had engaged thoughtfully with every concern raised. Every alternative suggested, every compromise proposed. He had shown a willingness to consider modified approaches while never wavering from his core conviction about his calling. On this crisp autumn morning, James arrived at Prince George's chambers to find the young prince packing books and papers into several boxes. There was an energy about him that James hadn't seen before, not the nervous energy of uncertainty, but the focused energy of someone preparing for action. "Good morning, James. I'm glad you're here early today. I have news. Good news, I hope, Your Royal Highness." Prince George turned from his packing with a smile that transformed his entire face. "The best news. My family has agreed to support my decision, with some conditions that I think are actually quite reasonable." James felt his heart leap with relief and excitement. "That's wonderful, Your Royal Highness. What are the conditions?" "First, I'm going to complete a university degree in education, with a focus on working with at-risk youth. They want me to have the strongest possible foundation for this work, which I completely agree with." Prince George pulled out a letter from a prestigious university's education program. "I've already been accepted for the spring term. I'll be studying child development, educational psychology, trauma-informed teaching methods, and specialized approaches for working with disadvantaged populations. That's excellent preparation for the work you want to do. The second condition is that I maintain some connection to my royal heritage, but in a way that supports my new path rather than conflicting with it. We're working on establishing a foundation focused on educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth. I'll serve as its active director, not just a figurehead." James was impressed by the thoughtfulness of this arrangement. It honored Prince George's royal background while channeling it toward his chosen calling. "And the third condition?" Prince George's expression became more serious. "That I take a year to work in various educational settings before making my final commitment. They want me to gain real experience, to make sure this isn't just an idealistic notion that won't survive contact with the challenging realities of this work." "That seems very wise. Your Royal Highness, I agree completely. I'll be working with several different organizations over the next year: an inner-city school, a residential program for youth aging out of foster care, and a community center that provides after-school support for children from low-income families." Prince George paused in his packing, looking directly at James with that intense focus that had become so familiar over the past few months. "James, this brings me to something important I want to discuss with you." James felt his pulse quicken, knowing that this conversation would likely determine his own future path. "I meant what I said about wanting your support as I pursue this new direction, but I've been thinking about what that might look like practically. And I have a proposal that I hope will appeal to you." Prince George pulled out another folder, this one containing information about various educational and youth service programs. "I know you have a background in security and protection, but I also know that you care about service and making a difference in people's lives. I'd like you to consider training as a counselor or youth worker." The suggestion caught James completely off guard. He had expected Prince George to ask him to continue in some kind of protective role, but this was something entirely different and entirely appealing. "Many of the young people I'll be working with have experienced trauma, family instability, or other challenges that make traditional educational approaches insufficient. They need adults who understand both their vulnerabilities and their potential, who can provide both guidance and protection in different ways than what I've been used to." James found himself leaning forward, genuinely intrigued by this possibility. "You're talking about a completely different kind of protection." "Exactly. Protection of their hopes, their potential, their right to believe in themselves despite difficult circumstances. I think your instincts for service, your ability to read people and situations, your calm presence under pressure, all of those qualities would translate beautifully to this kind of work." Prince George pulled out specific program information. "There are accelerated training programs for people with your background. The skills you've developed in royal protection, attention to detail, crisis management, the ability to maintain calm in difficult situations, these are all valuable in youth work. James looked through the materials, feeling a growing sense of excitement. The idea of using his protective instincts to help vulnerable young people rather than to guard privilege was deeply appealing. It felt like a natural evolution of his calling to service. Your Royal Highness, this is not what I expected, but it's exactly what I didn't know I wanted. Really? You're interested? More than interested. I'm inspired. You're right that the skills translate, but more than that, it feels like a way to honor everything my parents taught me about service, while also honoring what you've taught me about following your heart. Prince George's relief was evident. James, having you make this journey with me, having someone who understands both where I'm coming from and where I'm going, it would mean everything to me. They spent the morning going through the various training programs and opportunities, creating a plan that would allow both of them to develop the skills they needed for their new paths. James would begin with a youth counseling certification program, while Prince George started his university coursework, and they would both volunteer with local organizations to gain hands-on experience. There's one more thing, James, Prince George said as they finished their planning. I want to be completely honest about what we're choosing. This path won't be easy. We'll face criticism from people who think I'm abandoning my responsibilities. We'll work with young people who have faced terrible circumstances, and we won't be able to save everyone. The work will be demanding, sometimes heartbreaking, often frustrating. James nodded, appreciating the prince's honesty. But it will also be meaningful in a way that our current roles, however honorable, aren't quite achieving for either of us. That's exactly right. And James, I want you to know that you're not just choosing to support my decision. You're making your own choice about how you want to serve, how you want to make a difference. This is your calling too, not just mine. The recognition hit James with surprising force. Prince George was right. This wasn't just about supporting the young prince's decision. This was about James's own growth, his own recognition of where his heart was leading him. That afternoon, they walked through the castle grounds one more time, visiting the places where their conversations had begun. They stopped by the rose garden where they had first spoken with Mr. Henderson, and James marveled at how much had changed since that simple conversation about finding purpose in one's work. Mr. Henderson was right, wasn't he? Prince George said, as if reading James's thoughts. Purpose isn't found in what you do, but in how you choose to do it. But sometimes finding the right how means changing the what. He would be proud of you, Your Royal Highness. Of both of us. As they headed back toward the castle, James realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in both their lives. The roles they had known, the routines they had followed, the expectations they had lived under, all of that was about to change. But instead of fear or uncertainty, James felt a deep sense of anticipation and purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. 6 months later, James stood outside Roosevelt Elementary School in East London, watching Prince George, who now insisted on being called simply George, interact with a group of 7-year-olds during their lunch break. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable, but seeing George in this environment, completely in his element, still took James's breath away. The young man who had once moved through castle corridors with careful royal composure now sat cross-legged on the playground, animatedly discussing dinosaurs with a small boy whose enthusiasm knew no bounds. There was no trace of the formal distance that had characterized George's interactions in his previous life. Here he was simply a teacher who genuinely loved being around children. James himself had undergone his own transformation. The youth counseling certification program had been challenging but deeply rewarding, opening his eyes to approaches and perspectives he had never considered. He was now working as a counselor at a residential facility for teens aging out of foster care, while also serving as an informal advisor to George as they both navigated their new careers. Mr. James called Maria, a 10-year-old girl who had become one of his success stories at the residential facility. She was visiting the school as part of a mentorship program that George had helped establish. Look what Mr. George taught us to make. She held up an intricate paper airplane, her face glowing with pride. Maria had been one of the most challenging cases when James first met her. Angry, withdrawn, and convinced that no adult could be trusted. But over months of patient work, she had begun to open up, to believe in her own potential, to trust that there were adults who genuinely cared about her welfare. That's fantastic. Maria, I bet it flies really well. It does. Mr. George says I have a natural talent for engineering. He's teaching me about how airplanes actually work. And next week we're going to visit a real airport to see the big planes." James smiled, watching George continue his conversation with the dinosaur enthusiast while simultaneously keeping an eye on the other children in his care. The transition from prince to teacher hadn't been seamless. There had been moments of doubt, challenges that tested George's resolve, and criticism from those who felt he had abandoned his duty. But seeing him now, James knew without question that George had found his true calling. The announcement of George's decision had indeed created a media storm, with opinions ranging from admiration for his commitment to service to criticism of his departure from tradition. But as months passed and people saw the genuine nature of his commitment, the substance of his work with disadvantaged youth, public opinion had largely shifted to support. He wasn't playing at being a teacher. He was working 12-hour days, taking on the most challenging assignments, and making a real difference in children's lives. "James, could you help me with something?" George approached, leading a small girl by the hand. "This is Sarah, and she's having a difficult day. I thought maybe you could talk with her." James knelt down to Sarah's level, recognizing the signs of a child struggling with emotions too big for her small frame. At 8 years old, Sarah had already experienced more trauma than many adults, but she had also shown remarkable resilience when given the right support. "Hi, Sarah. I heard you're having a tough day. Want to tell me about it?" The conversation that followed was gentle, patient, and exactly the kind of work that James had discovered he was meant to do. Using techniques he had learned in his counseling training, he helped Sarah identify her feelings, understand her triggers, and develop strategies for managing difficult emotions. By the end of their talk, she was smiling again, ready to rejoin her classmates. "You're really good at that," George said quietly as they watched Sarah run off to play. "I know my family had their doubts about whether I could convince you to change careers, but watching you work with these kids, I think you were always meant for this." Funny how life works out sometimes. A year ago, I thought the highest form of service was protecting royalty. Now I realize it might be protecting something even more precious, these children's belief in their own potential. George nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, I have some news I wanted to share with you. The foundation my family helped establish has received approval for our next major project." James looked up with interest. Over the past 6 months, the foundation had grown from a small operation into a significant force for educational equity, funding programs, training teachers, and advocating for policy changes that would benefit disadvantaged youth. "We're going to open our own school," George continued, his eyes bright with excitement. "A place specifically designed for children who haven't succeeded in traditional educational settings. Kids from foster care, kids who've experienced trauma, kids whose families are dealing with poverty or instability." "That's incredible, George. What would make this school different?" "Everything. Small class sizes, trauma-informed teaching approaches, on-site counseling support, comprehensive wraparound services for families. We want to prove that with the right environment and support, every child can succeed." George pulled out a folder filled with architectural plans and program descriptions. "But here's the best part. I want you to be our director of student support services. You'd oversee all the counseling and mental health programming, train other staff in trauma-informed approaches, and help create an environment where kids feel safe enough to learn and grow." James looked through the plans, marveling at the thoughtfulness and comprehensiveness of the vision. This wasn't just another charter school or educational experiment. This was a carefully designed intervention that addressed every aspect of disadvantaged children's needs. "George, this is remarkable. But are you sure I'm qualified for such a significant role?" "James, you've spent the past 6 months proving that you have exactly the skills and instincts we need. More than that, you understand what we're trying to accomplish here. You've made the same journey I have, from one kind of service to another. You know what it means to choose purpose over convention." The offer was tempting beyond words, but James wanted to make sure he understood the full scope of what George was proposing. "Tell me more about the vision. What would make this school truly different?" George's passion was evident as he described the innovative approaches they planned to implement. "We'd start each day with mindfulness and emotional check-ins. Every child would have an assigned adult advocate who knows their story and supports their progress. We'd integrate life skills training with traditional academics, And we'd provide comprehensive support for families, not just students. What about the children who are dealing with the most severe trauma? That's where your expertise would be crucial. We'd have on-site therapy services, crisis intervention protocols, and specialized programs for kids dealing with specific challenges. The goal isn't just to educate these children, it's to heal them, to help them believe in their own futures. James felt his heart racing with excitement. This was exactly the kind of work he had discovered he was meant to do, but on a scale and with resources that could create lasting change for hundreds of children. There's one more thing, George added. The school would be located on an estate that my family has donated for this purpose. It's about an hour outside London, with enough space for residential programs for children who need that level of support. You'd be helping to create something completely new, something that could serve as a model for similar programs around the world. James looked at his friend, for that's what George had become, despite the years of formal distance between them, and saw the same passion and determination that had driven his decision to leave royal life behind. But he also saw something else, the confidence and peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be. George, when I first became your guard, I thought I was protecting a young prince. I never imagined I'd end up helping you protect something much more important, the hopes and dreams of children who need advocates. Is that a yes? James smiled, feeling the same sense of rightness that he had experienced months earlier when George first asked him to consider this journey. That's absolutely a yes. As they watched the children play, both men reflected on the unexpected path that had brought them to this moment. Neither had imagined a year ago that their lives would change so dramatically, but both now understood that sometimes the greatest act of service is having the courage to step away from expectations and follow your heart toward where you can make the biggest difference. 2 years after their conversation in the castle gardens, James stood in the main hall of Ashworth Academy, watching George address a gathering of students, parents, staff, and visitors who had come to celebrate the school's 2nd anniversary. The transformation in both men was complete now, but more importantly, the transformation they had helped create in the lives of their students was evident everywhere he looked. The school that had begun as an ambitious vision was now a thriving reality. What struck James most was not just the academic success of their students, though that was remarkable, but the change in their faces, their posture, their voices. Children who had arrived broken, angry, or withdrawn were now confident, engaged, and hopeful about their futures. When we started this journey, George was saying to the assembled crowd, we believed that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserved an education that honored their potential and addressed their needs. What we discovered was that these children didn't just need different teaching methods, they needed adults who believed in them unconditionally. James smiled, thinking about specific students whose stories embodied George's words. There was Marcus, who had arrived at age 9 having been in 6 different foster homes, unable to trust any adult. Now 11, he was student council president and wanted to become a teacher himself. There was Elena, whose family had fled domestic violence and who had barely spoken for her first 6 months at the school. She now led the drama club and had written a play about resilience that had moved audiences to tears. The real heroes of this story, George continued, are not the adults who founded this school, but the children who chose to trust us with their hopes and dreams. They taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to keep trying even when you're afraid. James thought about his own journey from Royal Guard to Student Support Director. The skills he had developed in his previous role, vigilance, crisis management, the ability to read situations quickly, had indeed translated beautifully to his work with traumatized youth. But he had also developed entirely new capabilities: patience with healing processes, creativity in reaching withdrawn children, and the ability to celebrate small victories while working toward larger goals. The most rewarding part of his work wasn't the dramatic turnaround stories, though those certainly happened. It was the daily process of helping children learn to trust, to try, to believe in their own capacity for growth. It was seeing a child who hadn't smiled in months finally laugh at something silly. It was watching a teenager who had given up on education discover a passion for science or art or literature. "Mr. James?" whispered a familiar voice. He looked down to see Sarah, now 10 years old and one of their most confident students. Are you proud of what we've built here? James knelt down to her level, struck by the question. Sarah had been one of their earliest students, arriving traumatized and barely functional. Now she was thriving academically and had become a mentor to newer students who were struggling with their own challenges. I'm incredibly proud, Sarah. But more than that, I'm grateful. Grateful that I got to be part of your story and that you became part of mine. Mr. George says that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that your life isn't going to go the way you planned. James chuckled, recognizing George's words. What do you think about that? I think he's right. If my life had gone the way it was planned, I'd probably still be sad and scared all the time. But because everything changed, I got to come here and learn that I'm actually really good at lots of things. The simple wisdom in her words took James's breath away. Here was a child who had experienced trauma and loss, but who had also experienced the transformative power of adults who believed in her potential. She understood at 10 years old, something that many adults never learned, that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected changes. As George concluded his remarks and the celebration moved into its reception phase, James found himself in conversation with Prince William and Catherine, who had become regular visitors to the school and strong supporters of its mission. James, Prince William said, I owe you an apology, Your Royal Highness. When George first told us about his decision and mentioned that he was hoping you would join him in this new path, I was concerned that he was asking you to give up a distinguished career for an uncertain future. Catherine nodded in agreement. We worried that you were being asked to sacrifice too much for our son's dream. But seeing you here, Prince William continued, watching you with these children, understanding the impact you're having, I realize we had it backwards. George wasn't asking you to sacrifice anything. He was offering you the chance to find your true calling. James felt deeply moved by their words. Your Royal Highness, I appreciate that. But I want you to know that George never pressured me to make this choice. He simply helped me see possibilities I hadn't considered, and then supported me in exploring whether this path was right for me. That's exactly the kind of leadership we hoped he would develop, Catherine said, the ability to see potential in others and help them discover it for themselves. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the guests had departed, James and George sat in George's office, reviewing applications from children hoping to attend the school the following year. The demand far exceeded their capacity, which was both heartening and heartbreaking. We're going to need to expand, George said, looking at the stack of applications. There are too many children who need what we offer. I've been thinking about that, James replied. What if we developed a model that other schools could replicate? Training programs for teachers and counselors, curriculum packages, consultation services to help existing schools adopt trauma-informed approaches? George's eyes lit up with excitement. A network of schools all working from the same principles but adapted to their local communities. We could reach thousands of children instead of hundreds. Exactly. And we could train people like us, individuals who have discovered this calling later in life, who bring different skills and perspectives to youth work. As they talked through the possibilities, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been a royal guard whose primary concern was physical protection. Now he was helping to develop an educational model that could protect something far more precious, the potential of vulnerable children. James, George said as they prepared to close the office for the night, I want to ask you something I've been thinking about for a while. Of course. Do you ever regret the choice we made? Do you ever miss the certainty and prestige of royal service? James considered the question seriously. You know, there are moments when I remember the simplicity of our old roles, the clear protocols, the defined expectations, the sense of being part of something historic and important. But then I think about Marcus learning to trust adults for the first time, or Elena finding her voice through drama, or Sarah developing the confidence to mentor other children. I think about the teenagers we've helped transition successfully out of foster care, the families we've supported through crisis, the teachers we've trained to recognize and respond to trauma. James paused, looking around the office filled with student artwork, achievement certificates, and photos of school events. George, we're still serving something historic and important. We're just defining it differently, George smiled. The same peaceful expression James had seen that first day when they realized they were both ready to follow their hearts toward a different kind of service. You know what I think our real achievement is? George asked. What's that? We proved that it's never too late to choose purpose over convention, that it's possible to honor your background while still following your calling, and that the greatest service sometimes requires the courage to step away from expectations. As they left the school that night, walking past classrooms where tomorrow dozens of children would continue their journeys of healing and growth, James felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your life has meaning. He had found his true calling not in spite of his background as a royal guard, but because of the values and skills that role had taught him. The young prince who had questioned his predetermined path had become a teacher who helped children discover their own paths. The royal guard who had protected privilege had become a counselor who protected potential, and together, they had created something that honored both their heritage of service and their commitment to following their hearts toward where they could make the greatest difference in the world.